Hey guys, in today's video, I bring you an impactful story full of surprising revelations. Let's learn the story of Sister Calliope Renshaw, a Carmelite nun who literally crossed the veil of death and came back after 23 minutes, clinically dead. But what she saw on the other side will leave you speechless. Jesus Christ revealed to her the true identity of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and it was not just a snake, but Lucifer, the fallen cherub. This bombshell revelation changes everything you thought you knew about spiritual warfare and the power of the cross. So, before we dive into this transformative spiritual journey, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this, and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Now, prepare yourself for a near-death experience that will change your outlook on the spiritual world and eternity. My name is Sister Calliope Renshaw, and I have dedicated the last 45 years of my life to serving God at St. Helena's Convent in Willow Spring in Indiana. From a young age, I felt the divine calling. My parents, devout Irish immigrants, never fully understood my decision to renounce the world, but they respected my desire to live in complete devotion. At the age of 23, I left ordinary life behind and took on the habit of the Carmelites. Since then, my life has been marked by contemplative prayer, silence and meditation on the scriptures. Each morning began with the office of the hours, the prayers resounding through the ancient corridors of the convent like an echo of eternity. The smell of incense mixed with the soft scent of candles, creating a sacred, almost tangible atmosphere. I wasn't looking for miracles. My faith was simple, like water that runs calmly in a stream. The convent's routine was both monotonous and deeply meaningful. I found myself taking care of the little things, polishing the pews in the chapel, tending to the roses in the garden, preparing the bread for the Eucharist. Each task, no matter how simple, was an offering to the Lord. For me, the most powerful prayer was silent work, where my hands spoke to God without the need for words. Life at the convent also brought me deep friendships. Sister Eloise Marlowe, my cellmate, was one of those souls who lit up the room with just a smile. We often sat under the shade of the large oak tree in the inner courtyard, sharing stories from our childhoods, laughing softly so as not to disturb the sacred silence. She always said, "Calliope, I see in you a faith that moves mountains." I smiled, but I never saw myself that way. In fact, my constant prayer was for the grace of humility. However, even in the serenity of the convent, the outside world always found an opening to infiltrate. Father Thaddeus Bellamy, our chaplain, often brought news from the world. His deep voice sounded at weekly meetings, reading letters and sharing stories from the local parish. He was a man of robust faith, but also a skeptic when it came to mystical experiences. I respected his stance, as I believed that true faith does not need miraculous proof to sustain itself. On that particular day, September 23, 2023, the sun shone with an intensity that made the shadows of the rose bushes dance on the ground. I was kneeling in the dirt, trimming the thorns and removing the dry leaves. The scent of roses was so sweet it was almost palpable. It was then that everything changed. A sharp pain shot through my chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. Sweat broke out on my forehead, and my vision began to blur. I felt my hands lose strength, and the pruning shears fell to the ground, sinking gently into the wet mud. My last earthly memories were a mix of sensations: the smell of roses, the cool touch of the earth on my skin, and the distant sound of Sister Eloise's voice calling my name. Everything went dark, and the world moved away from me. The pain suddenly stopped, as if a stream of cold water had put out the burning fire in my chest. I was enveloped by a feeling of absolute weightlessness, as if my body had become a feather floating in a gentle breeze. I opened my eyes, or at least I felt myself opening them. But the world around me was no longer the convent garden. There was no longer the blue sky, the red roses, or the rustling of the trees in the wind. I was surrounded by pure light, a light that seemed to emanate from all directions at once, enveloping me in a warm, indescribable embrace. This light was not just visible, it was alive. Every particle glowed with a love so intense that it seemed to penetrate directly into my soul. There were no shadows. There was no fear. The silence there was not the absence of sound, but rather a silent melody, as if each ray of light sang a note in the symphony of creation. All around me, Indescribable colors danced in harmony, tones that my human eyes could never comprehend. I felt myself being carried, not like someone walking, but like someone floating in a river of light. There was no weight on my body, and the sense of time seemed to not exist. It was as if each moment were eternal, and at the same time, everything happened in a single instant. My thoughts were not limited by logic or the linearity of time. I knew, I felt, I understood everything at once. And then, in the heart of that light, a presence began to form. At first drawn, it was just a greater intensity of the light itself, but as I got closer, a figure began to emerge. It was no ordinary figure. Its outline seemed to vibrate between the physical and the spiritual, as if it were made of the very essence of light. Your eyes, I can never forget them. They were like windows to eternity, deep and welcoming. There was an endless wisdom there, but also a gentleness that melted any resistance. I felt my legs weaken, and without realizing it, I was already on my knees. The figure didn't need to say who it was. My spirit recognized him immediately. Jesus Christ. Just being in front of him was enough for my entire being to be filled with adoration. I didn't need words, I didn't need thoughts. My soul sang, my heart burned, and that's when he reached out his hand. His touch was like a river of living water, and where his fingers touched my spiritual skin, I felt a healing, restoring, filling warmth. He helped me up and, without moving his lips, spoke directly to my heart. Calliope, my daughter, you were called to see and to speak. Don't be afraid. His words were like a melody that calmed all the storms inside me. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew with every fiber of my being that I was safe. At that moment, all the questions I carried in my earthly life disappeared. The why or the how no longer mattered. Everything I needed was right in front of me. The very source of life, the eternal word, love incarnate. Jesus held my hand firmly, and at the touch of his spiritual skin, I felt a wave of warmth and peace that passed through my entire being. His presence was both majestic and humble, as if the universe itself bowed before him. But he chose to approach me with the tenderness of a close friend. His eyes, those abysses of love and eternity, stared at me with a depth that laid bare my soul, revealing everything I was, my flaws, my virtues, my fears, and my faith. And yet, all I felt from him was unconditional love. He didn't need to use words to communicate to me the importance of what I was about to see. With a simple movement of his hand, the environment around us began to change. The pure light that surrounded us rippled, like a veil being drawn aside, and suddenly, we were in a garden of indescribable beauty. The air there seemed alive. Every tree leaf, every flower, and every drop of dew sparkled with a life of its own, as if divine love itself permeated every particle of that place. You are in the Garden of Eden. Jesus' voice resounded in my mind without moving his lips. His tone was both solemn and compassionate. Eden was more real than anything I had ever experienced on earth. The grass beneath my feet seemed to pulse gently, as if in tune with the very heart of God. The colors were more vibrant, the sounds purer. There was a river that meandered through the garden, its crystal-clear waters producing a soft melody, harmonizing with the wind and the songs of the birds. However, the peace of the place was interrupted by a presence. In the center of the garden, under the shadow of a majestic tree, a figure appeared. It was not a serpent, as I always imagined when reading Genesis, but rather a celestial creature with a dazzling and disturbing appearance. Her body seemed to be made of light, reflecting iridescent colors like those of a pearl under the sun. Precious stones adorned his being, each one reflecting the glory around him. This is the true serpent of Eden, Jesus explained. Lucifer, the anointed cherub who rebelled against the Creator. The celestial figure seemed to have a beauty that surpassed human understanding, but its eyes carried a cunning and emptiness that contrasted with the light around it. There was something deeply wrong with this creature. His presence brought a sense of unrest, as if his very essence were a distortion of the divine harmony of the garden. Lucifer walked among the trees with an almost hypnotic grace. When he approached Eva, his face was of enigmatic sweetness. His words were not those of a slithering serpent, but of a high-ranking celestial being, offering not just a fruit, but an idea, a question. Did God really say? Those three simple words resounded like thunder in Eden. It wasn't just a question. It was the beginning of a cosmic rebellion. a seed of doubt planted not only in Eve's heart, but in the order of creation itself. Jesus squeezed my hand and hot tears ran down my face. For the first time, I understood the true depth of humanity's fall. It was not just about a forbidden fruit, but about a spiritual battle far beyond human understanding, where the pride and rebellion of a fallen cherub dragged humanity away from the light of God. "Now you understand," Jesus said softly, "and it is this truth that you must share when you return." The vision of the Garden of Eden began to fade, but the presence of Jesus remained at my side. His hand still held mine, and I felt as if an indescribable force flowed from him to me. All around us, the light intensified again, until all I saw was a warm white glow. I felt that we were moving, not as someone who walks, but as someone who is transported by the divine will itself. Suddenly, the scenario changed again. Now, I was faced with a completely different scene. It was Golgotha, the crucifixion. The sky was gray and heavy, the air thick with palpable sadness. The sound of the wind mixed with the cries of the people around the cross. But there was also a dark presence, something beyond human pain. I saw Jesus on the cross, but not just the man Jesus, suffering physically. What I saw was a spiritual battle unfolding beyond the veil of reality. All around Calvary, shadows moved. Spiritual beings of darkness surrounded the scene, like predators waiting for the moment to attack. However, among these shadows, there was one figure that stood out: Lucifer, no longer the shining cherub of Eden, but a dark entity, still carrying remnants of its former glory, distorted by pride and rebellion. He watched the crucifixion with a mixture of hatred and expectation. It was as if he believed that moment would be his final victory, the culmination of his rebellion. But then, I saw the true purpose of the cross. When Jesus breathed his last and proclaimed, "It is finished," the impact of those words ripped through the spiritual world like a seismic wave. Light exploded from the cross, not a soft light like that of Eden, but a light of fire, of justice, of victory. I saw invisible chains breaking. I saw shadows retreating and dark spiritual beings being cast away. Lucifer shouted, a sound that was not just auditory, but seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of creation. I saw his form being thrown to the ground, crushed by the light emanating from Christ's sacrifice. And it was at that moment that I understood what Jesus was showing me. The cross was not just a redemption for humanity, but a cosmic victory. The head of the serpent was crushed, not just metaphorically, but spiritually. The cosmic rebellion that began in Eden found its end on Calvary. Jesus' sacrifice not only redeemed human sin, but also sealed the defeat of the one who had introduced evil into creation. Jesus turned to me. His expression was one of deep seriousness, but also of indescribable love. "Calliope, the world needs to know that my victory was not just over human sin. It was a restoration of all creation. The enemy has been defeated, but he still deceives. He still tries to blind hearts and minds." I felt my own spirit trembling, not with fear, but with awe. I understood, at that moment, that my mission was not just to tell about heaven or the beauty of divine love. It was a call to reveal the true nature of spiritual warfare, to show that the evil we face is not just a reflection of our fallen nature, but an ongoing struggle against spiritual forces of evil. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder and, in that touch, I felt a transfer of strength. "Go, Calliope. Tell the world what you saw. Help them understand that the battle has never been against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of this dark world. But most of all, tell them I won, and that, in my victory, they find safety, hope, and redemption." The light around us began to intensify once again, and I felt something was changing. My time there was coming to an end. A mixture of peace and urgency washed over me. I knew I needed to go back, but I also knew that nothing would be the same as before. The light around me began to transform again, and I felt a gentle tug, as if my spirit was being drawn back into my earthly body. The presence of Jesus remained by my side until the last moment, and as the light faded, his words echoed in my soul. "Tell them what you saw. The truth will set free those who have ears to hear." The return was a shock. Suddenly, all the warmth and peace of that spiritual dimension gave way to the sterile cold of the hospital. My eyes slowly opened, and the fluorescent ceiling light seemed harsh and dull compared to the heavenly glow I had just left behind. My lungs burned, Each breath was an effort, as if my body resisted the return of life. Above me, confused and astonished faces watched me. Dr. Michael Larkin stood among them, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. He seemed to struggle to process what he saw. Sister Calliope, her voice sounded shaky. You were dead. 23 minutes and 17 seconds. His words barely made sense to me at that moment. I was more aware of the sensation of my heart beating, the air rushing into my lungs, the cool touch of the electrodes against my skin. Each physical sensation seemed more intense, almost painful. Wake her up carefully, I heard a nurse instruct. There are no signs of brain damage. It's a miracle. I struggled to speak. My voice was barely a whisper. Jesus. I saw. Dr. Larkins approached, his eyes expressing a mixture of skepticism and hope. What did you say, sister? I gathered all my strength and held his hand. He flinched at the touch, perhaps expecting to feel the coldness of death, but found warmth instead. I saw Jesus. He showed me the truth. The doctor's eyes widened, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Sister Eloise Marlowe, who was at the bedside, let out a stifled sob. She had been my most faithful friend at the convent, and when she saw that I had returned, her knees gave way, and she fell to her knees beside the bed, muttering prayers through her tears. The presence of the Holy Spirit was almost palpable in that room. Even those who professed no faith seemed filled with an atmosphere of reverence. Calliope, what happened? Sister Eloise asked, her voice cracking with emotion. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and with each breath, strength returned to my body. I died, Eloise, and I was taken to a dimension of light. I found Jesus. He showed me the Garden of Eden. He revealed to me the true nature of the serpent. It was not a snake, but Lucifer, the fallen cherub. The faces around me displayed a mixture of shock and fascination. Dr. Larkin seemed torn between his scientific training and the living evidence before him. That's impossible, he murmured, but there was a crack in his tone, a fissure in the wall of his skepticism. I knew this was just the first of many times I would have to tell my story, and I also knew that not everyone would believe it. But the call Jesus gave me was clear. I should speak. I should share. As my voice echoed through the hospital room, I felt the words weren't just mine. It was as if a current of life and truth flowed through me, reaching every person present. I had returned, and the mission had just begun. The days that followed my return were a mix of amazement, recovery, and confrontation. At the hospital, my physical recovery was considered nothing short of miraculous. Doctors and nurses passed by my room with expressions that wavered between disbelief and reverence. Dr. Michael Larkins, the cardiologist who pronounced me clinically dead, visited me daily. His professional posture little by little fell apart, revealing a man in conflict with everything he believed in until then. I need to understand, he said during one of the visits, sitting next to my bed. Clinically, there is no explanation for his recovery. No brain damage, no sequelae. It's as if he hesitated, as if the words were weighing on his tongue. As if God brought me back, I added softly. He released a breath he seemed to hold for a long time. If I admit this, I will have to review everything I believe. It is not a surrender to ignorance, Doctor. It is an opening to the truth. I could see the battle in his eyes. For someone whose life has always been guided by science and reason, my report was a chink in the armor of skepticism. Meanwhile, Sister Eloise never left my side. She was the first to hear my full story. Sitting on the bench in the hospital garden, I told her every detail: the encounter with Jesus, the true nature of the serpent, the cosmic victory of the cross. Her tears were not of sadness, but of deep spiritual emotion. Calliope, you need to tell the world this, she said, holding my hands in hers. This will change lives. The news of my miraculous return began to spread. Soon, Martha Caldwell, an investigative journalist, arrived at the hospital. She was not driven by faith, but rather by the search for truth, or, at least, a good story. I heard you were dead for over 20 minutes, she began, as she adjusted the recorder on the table next to my bed, and that you had a spiritual experience. Yes, but it wasn't just an experiment, I corrected. It was a mission. Martha listened to me with the neutral expression of a professional, but her eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. As I related what I saw and heard, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the fall of Lucifer and the victory of Christ on the cross, I saw his posture change. She began asking questions not just as a journalist, but as someone searching for something greater, something beyond what the physical world could offer. That night, after the interview, Martha came back to my room. His expression was different, softer, almost vulnerable. I don't know what to believe, she admitted, but something in your eyes, in your voice, I feel like there's truth in that. The truth doesn't need to be forced, Martha. It finds its way to willing hearts. The journalist was gone, but I knew the seed had been planted. My mission was just beginning. Jesus had given me a task, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. Sharing such a profound revelation would require not just words but also the courage to face skepticism, doubt, and even opposition. Yet each conversation, each testimony shared, was like a new petal opening on the rose of truth. I was not just telling a story but bringing the light of Christ into the darkest corners of human doubt. The following days were intense. Still in the hospital, I underwent a series of tests. Dr. Michael Larkins seemed determined to find a rational explanation for what had happened to me. He brought CT scans, electroencephalograms, and blood tests, hoping that some data would explain my miraculous recovery. But with each normal result, his frustration grew, and I could see the walls of his skepticism beginning to crumble. It doesn't make sense, Sister Calliope. He sat on the edge of my bed, holding a clipboard that looked heavier than it really was. You were dead for more than 20 minutes. No brain survives this long without irreversible damage. I smiled, not with arrogance, but with the serenity of someone who no longer needed proof. Sometimes, doctor, what doesn't make sense to science is exactly what makes sense to faith. He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. I always believed that the world was only what we could see, touch, and measure. But since you came back, something changed in me. Maybe it's the beginning of a journey, just like it was for me. While my physical recovery surprised the doctors, my spiritual life took a new direction. I was discharged from the hospital and returned to the convent of Santa Helena. But the environment there was no longer the same. I felt an urgency, a pressure on my spirit as if time was running faster. The convent, which had previously been a haven of silence and contemplation, now seemed too small for the mission I needed to accomplish. Sister Eloise welcomed me with open arms, but even she could see that I had changed. Calliope, your presence carries something different, she told me one morning while we were gardening. You've always been devout, but now, it's as if you carry a living flame. I hugged her, and silent tears rolled down my face. I saw Christ himself, Eloise, and he showed me profound truths. I can no longer hide behind the convent walls. Hearing this, Father Thaddeus Bellamy joined the conversation. His face bore a cautious expression. Faith must be tempered by prudence, and Sister Calliope. Sharing these views can bring confusion. What if the objective is precisely to bring light where there is confusion? I replied, feeling a courage that was not mine. Father Thaddeus sighed. I just ask that you be careful. The outside world doesn't always welcome what it doesn't understand. From that moment on, I began to share my testimony beyond the convent walls. Martha Caldwell returned, this time with cameras and a small film crew. She asked permission to record my story and turn it into a documentary. It's not just a religious story, sister. It is a story of transformation, of hope. I accepted, but made it clear that I was not looking for fame or recognition. All I want is for people to understand the truth. Let them know that the serpent was not just a figure of speech, but a cosmic rebellion against God, and that Christ's victory on the cross was a restoration not only for humanity, but for all creation. The first filming was in the convent itself. I sat under the same oak tree where I had talked to Sister Eloise so many times. The camera seemed small and harmless, but I knew my words could travel far beyond that place. As the sun set behind the convent windows, I began to tell my story. Every word seemed loaded with spiritual weight, as if the Holy Spirit himself was guiding my voice. At the end of the recording, there was a deep silence. Even the coaches on Martha's team, many of whom had no religious inclination, seemed touched. I knew the road ahead would be tough. There would be criticism. There would be those who called me crazy. There would be those who attributed my visions to hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen in the brain. But I also knew that among these voices there would be open hearts, ready to hear the truth. And it was to these hearts that I spoke. As my story spread, the world's response was mixed. Some people listened to my account with open hearts. touched by the revelation that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not just a literal serpent, but Lucifer, the fallen cherub, who rebelled against God. Others, however, saw in my words only the delusions of a mind affected by clinical death. Critics spoke out on radio and television shows, and articles appeared on the internet, questioning my sanity and even my spiritual integrity. But amid this storm, there were also those who reached out in search of answers. Ordinary people who carried doubts, pains, and spiritual longings in their hearts. The convent, previously a place of silence and isolation, began to receive visitors. They came from far away, guided by curiosity or hope. I remember a young girl named Sarah. She arrived at the convent on a cloudy afternoon, her hands shaking, holding a worn rosary. His eyes had the dull glow of someone who had lost so much. "Sister Calliope, I heard your story." His voice was a whisper. "My brother took his own life 2 months ago, and since then I haven't been able to find peace. If the serpent is such a powerful spiritual force, how can we have hope?" I held your hands and felt your pain as if it were my own. Jesus showed me that, despite the cosmic rebellion, victory has already been won. The enemy can try, deceive, but he has already been defeated. The cross was not just an act of human redemption, but a restoration of all creation. "Your brother is in the hands of a God who is pure love," Sarah cried, but they were tears of relief. And in that moment, I realized that my mission was not just to share a revelation, but also to be a channel of comfort and hope. Even Dr. Michael Larkins, who had previously looked at me with skepticism, began to transform. He started attending weekly meetings at the convent, where I led spiritual reflections. "I still don't know if I believe everything, sister," he told me one day after one of the meetings, "but I feel like I need to hear more. Faith is not a blind leap, doctor. It's a step towards the light, even if you only see a small crack." Sister Eloise became my constant companion. Together, we answered letters and emails, shared prayers, and guided those who came to us. Father Thaddeus, although still cautious, began to discreetly support me. "Calliope, I fear the consequences, but I see that your mission is true," he admitted during a conversation in the convent's refectory. "Maybe God is using you for something greater than we can understand." Martha Caldwell released the documentary, and it quickly gained attention. Amidst the skeptical comments were testimonies of people who had found a new faith, who had been touched by the message of spiritual victory. The spiritual battle that Jesus revealed to me was not just theoretical. It was real, palpable, manifesting itself in the lives of those who sought the light. And even as the shadows seemed thicker, I remembered Christ's words, "Tell them what you saw. The victory has already been won." I knew I wasn't alone. There was a divine presence guiding every step, every word, and as long as there was a heart willing to listen, I would continue sharing the truth entrusted to me. Time passed, and although my mission continued, I felt my spiritual resistance also increase. Each time I shared my story, it seemed as if unseen forces were moving to suppress the truth. The nights became longer, and the dreams became more intense. I would often wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of a dark presence in the room, shadows that dissipated as quickly as they appeared. However, my faith never wavered. I was constantly reminded of what Jesus had shown me, that the spiritual battle was not just against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, and that, despite the intensity of the fight, victory had already been won on the cross. One morning, when I woke up, I felt pressure in my chest. It was not physical, but spiritual. It was as if a deep sadness had settled in my soul. I went to the convent chapel, where the morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in soft colors. I knelt before the tabernacle and began to pray. "Lord, if this is the battle I must face, give me strength. If the enemy wishes to silence my voice, give me the courage to continue." As I prayed, a sweet peace came over me. A light breeze passed through the chapel, and I felt as if an invisible hand was resting on my shoulder. It was then that Sister Eloise entered silently. His eyes were teary, but there was a determination in his expression. "Calliope, there are people outside. They came to hear his testimony." I got up, still feeling the remnants of that divine presence, and followed my friend to the convent courtyard. A small crowd had formed. There were faces of all ages and origins. Some held crucifixes, others just had their hands clasped in prayer. "Sister Calliope, talk to us," someone asked. I took a deep breath and began to tell my experience once again. I spoke about the encounter with Jesus, about the true nature of the serpent, about the cosmic rebellion, and the eternal victory of the cross. My words came out effortlessly, as if I were just a channel through which the Holy Spirit flowed. In the crowd, I saw Dr. Michael Larkins. His eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time, I saw in them not just curiosity, but faith. Beside him, Martha Caldwell was taking notes, but her expression was that of someone who was absorbing every word, not just as a journalist, but as someone in search of a greater truth. When I finished, the silence was broken only by the gentle sound of the wind. One by one, people began to kneel, some crying, others whispering prayers. I approached Sarah, the young woman who had lost her brother. She was among those present, and when I held her hands, I saw that the sparkle had returned to her eyes. "I understand, sister," she said, her words filled with gratitude. "The enemy tried to make me believe that everything was lost, but now I know that victory has already been won." It was a moment of redemption, not just for her, but for all of us. At dusk, when the crowd had dispersed, I returned to the chapel. I knelt down once again, not to ask, but to thank. "Thank you, Lord, for allowing me to be a small flame in the darkness. May your light continue to shine, even when my voice is silent." The divine presence filled the room, and I felt that, regardless of what the future brought, I had accomplished the mission given to me. As my message spread, I realized that the spiritual battle was not just restricted to the invisible world, but also manifested itself in concrete ways in the physical world. I received invitations to speak at churches, events, and even television programs. However, along with the open doors came the most intense criticism. Renowned theologians, skeptical scientists, and even religious leaders questioned my sanity, my motivations, and even my faith. "She is promoting heresies," I heard a pastor say during a live broadcast. "This story of Lucifer in the Garden of Eden as a fallen cherub is a dangerous interpretation." I knew that truth, when confronted with traditions and spiritual comforts, can cause discomfort. However, my mission was not to please or convince. It was just sharing what was shown to me. Amid the controversy, I continued to receive people seeking answers. At the convent, we set aside a small room for private meetings, where I could listen, counsel, and pray with those who felt the touch of the Holy Spirit through my testimony. Every conversation was an opportunity to bring the light of Christ to hurting hearts. One afternoon, I was surprised by a visit from a middle-aged man. He wore simple clothes and carried a worn-out Bible. Upon entering the room, he immediately knelt down, tears already streaming down his face. "Sister Calliope, I am Michael. I lost my wife to cancer last year and have since turned away from God." His voice was broken with emotion. "But when I heard your story, something inside me lit up again." I approached him and helped him get up. "Michael, God never abandoned you. The pain you feel is real, but the love of Christ is greater than any suffering." We prayed together, and at that moment, I felt like an invisible chain had been broken. I saw hope reborn in his eyes. It wasn't just individuals who were being touched. Sister Eloise herself, who had always been my greatest ally, began to have profound spiritual experiences. She confided in me that she had dreams in which she saw Jesus walking through the corridors of the convent, blessing each room and each sister. "It's like heaven is getting closer, Calliope," she whispered, her eyes shining with faith. Even Dr. Michael Larkins, the skeptical doctor, came closer to faith. He started attending prayer meetings, and one night he looked for me in the convent garden. "I can't deny it anymore," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's not just the miracle of your recovery, but the impact your message is having on people. I need this God you knew." We prayed together right there under the starry sky. He, the man of science, gave his life to him who is the source of all truth. As my mission continued, I also realized that the enemy was not idle. Spiritual attacks intensified, disturbing dreams, feelings of overwhelm, and even dangerous situations arose. On one of the trips to give my testimony, the car I was in suffered brake failure. We almost didn't suffer a serious accident. However, the divine protection was palpable. I knew that as long as I stayed true to the mission, nothing could stop me. Jesus had already won the greatest battle, and I was just a messenger of that victory. Days turned into weeks and then months. My physical health was restored, but my soul burned with a flame that could not be put out. He continued sharing the message of the true nature of the serpent and the cosmic victory of the cross. And with each testimony, with each heart reached, I felt that the kingdom of God was advancing, pushing the darkness away. Time at the convent of Santa Helena continued to flow, but my life was never the same. Each week, new people arrived at the convent gate, seeking spiritual comfort and answers to their own inner battles. The small courtyard, where previously only the sisters prayed in silence, was now a place of fervent prayers, chants and accounts of spiritual transformation. I saw there the tangible manifestation of what Jesus had shown me, an intense spiritual battle, but where light always prevailed over darkness. During a cold winter morning, as I was walking through the frost-covered garden, I was approached by Father Thaddeus. His serious face carried a mix of worry and relief. "Calliope, I just received a call from the diocese," he said, his voice a whisper. "The bishop wishes to speak with you." A chill ran down my spine. I knew that my message had reached many hearts, but I also knew that the church, as an institution, might view my revelations with reservations. My mission was not to confront the church, but to share the truth I was given. A few days later, I traveled to the headquarters of the diocese. I was received in a simple room, with white walls and a large wooden cross in the center. The bishop, an elderly man with a penetrating gaze, was waiting for me. "Sister Calliope, I've heard a lot about you," he began, his fingers intertwined on the table. "Your message has generated repercussions. Some good, others not so much. Your Excellency, my objective was never to create divisions. I only share what Christ himself showed me." He remained silent for a moment, weighing every word. The concept of the serpent as Lucifer, the fallen cherub. It is a bold interpretation, a revelation that, if true, could transform the way we understand the fall of humanity and Christ's victory on the cross. I stood my ground. I'm not looking for recognition, just to fulfill the mission given to me. The bishop sighed, his face softening. "I believe in you, sister, but we need to be cautious. The message must be shared, yes, but with discernment." I left that meeting relieved, not only because of the support of the bishop, but because of the certainty that the truth would always find its way, even through ecclesiastical structures. Back at the convent, I continued my mission. Martha Caldwell's documentary had spread even further, being translated into different languages and reaching people around the world. Testimonies arrived from distant countries, from people who had been touched by the message that the spiritual battle goes beyond human understanding, but that Christ's victory was absolute. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was from Dr. Michael Larkins. He had decided to abandon medicine to dedicate himself to spiritual ministry. "Your experience made me see that true healing is not just in the body, but in the soul," he wrote. "I'm going to start spiritual counseling work, helping those who, like me, were looking for answers only in science, but who need the light of faith." I cried when I read your words. It was further proof that the mission was bearing fruit. Sister Eloise, always by my side, suggested that we start recording all the reports, all the experiences of people who came to us. We formed a small prayer group, which quickly grew into a spiritual movement. The letters kept arriving. People reported spiritual experiences, prophetic dreams, and freedoms from oppressions they previously did not understand. Many confirmed the message that the serpent continues to deceive, but that the power of Christ is enough to free any soul that cries out to him. Each day was a new miracle, a new opportunity to witness the power of light over darkness, and I knew that as long as I breathed, I would continue to bring this message to the world. My mission had become bigger than I ever imagined. The movement of prayer and spiritual revelation that began at St. Helena's Convent now spread beyond the borders of Willow Spring, Indiana. Churches of different denominations began inviting me to share my testimony. Martha Caldwell's documentary reached a worldwide audience, and the messages we received were often from people in places where Jesus' name was barely spoken. I knew, however, that the spiritual battle was not over. In fact, I felt that the enemy was intensifying his attempts to silence my voice. Disturbing dreams came back to haunt me. I saw shadows in the corners of the rooms, whispers in the silence of the early morning, and an invisible pressure that seemed to try to crush my faith. During one particularly difficult night, I woke up feeling suffocated. My breathing was ragged, and it felt like the very air around me had become heavy and dense. I struggled to get up from the bed, but my body was paralyzed. In my mind, a voice hissed, full of hatred and resentment. "You shouldn't have come back." I closed my eyes and, with the little strength I had left, I whispered the name of Jesus. Immediately, the darkness dissipated, a soft light filled the room, and I could breathe again. The next day, I shared this experience with Sister Eloise. She looked at me with concern, but also with firm conviction. The enemy knows that his voice is reaching souls. He tries to intimidate you, but the light will always prevail. To reinforce our spiritual protection, we organize prayer vigils. Sisters and visitors gathered in the chapel, where the sound of chants echoed like a wall of faith against the darkness. It was during one of these vigils that a new revelation was given to me. As we prayed, I felt a sweet, powerful presence. I closed my eyes and saw myself once again surrounded by that celestial light. Jesus was there, not like a distant vision, but so close that I felt his touch on my hands. "Calliope, you did what I asked you, but there is more. The battle continues, but you will not fight alone." He showed me visions of other people around the world who were having similar experiences. I saw men and women, from different cultures and languages, being called to share the same message, that the serpent continues to deceive, but that the love of Christ has already triumphed. When I came to, I realized that the other sisters in the chapel had also felt something. Many were crying, others were kneeling in deep adoration. The divine presence was almost palpable. From that moment on, my mission was no longer just mine. We train others to share their own spiritual experiences. We formed small prayer and Bible study groups, where each person was encouraged to seek a direct and deep relationship with Jesus. Father Thaddeus Yan, who had always been cautious, began to actively participate in these meetings. His own faith was renewed, and he began sharing stories of miracles he had witnessed during his ministry. Dr. Michael Larkins, now dedicated to spiritual counseling, brought his medical expertise to help those who needed to balance physical and spiritual care. Together, we created a shelter for people in crisis, where body, mind, and soul were treated with love and compassion. And Martha Caldwell, she became more than a journalist. Her own faith blossomed, and she began producing new documentaries, telling stories of transformation and redemption from around the world. The spiritual battle still existed, but now I clearly saw the army of light that was rising. It wasn't just me, it wasn't just the convent. It was the body of Christ itself, awakening to its true identity and mission. And as long as there were souls to reach, hearts to heal, and eyes to open, I would continue, not with my own strength, but with the strength of the one who called me. Time seemed to flow differently since my near-death experience. As the spiritual movement grew around me, I felt the approach of a new calling, a subtle but inevitable transition. The convent of St. Helena became a point of light in the midst of darkness, welcoming pilgrims, spiritual seekers, and even those who previously criticized us, but now came in search of answers. One night, while praying alone in the chapel, I felt that divine presence again. It was not an intense vision like before, but a deep peace that came over me. I heard the voice of Jesus, soft and clear in my heart. "Calliope, your mission is coming to an end. You planted the seeds, and now others must water and reap the fruits." My hands were shaking. I knew what that meant. I knew my time on earth was coming to an end. But instead of fear, I felt gratitude. I shared this revelation with Sister Eloise. She, who has always been my friend and spiritual partner, cried, but not out of sadness. "You're going where you always belonged, Calliope, and your message will remain with us." From that moment on, I started preparing. I wrote letters, recorded videos, and left messages for those who would continue the work. Father Thaddeus and Dr. Michael Larkins took on more active responsibilities, while Martha Caldwell prepared a new documentary that would be released after my departure, a message of hope and faith for the world. My last few days were peaceful. I received visits from many people who had been touched by the message. Sarah, the young woman who had lost her brother, was now a strong woman, guiding others going through the same pain. Michael, the man who had rediscovered his faith after his wife's death, was now a pastor, bringing the message of restoration to entire communities. On the morning of September 23, 2024, exactly 1 year after my near-death experience, I felt my time had come. I was lying in my simple cell in the convent, surrounded by the sisters and friends who became my spiritual family. "I'm ready," I whispered, holding Sister Eloise's hand. My eyes closed, and I was once again enveloped by the light. There was no pain, there was no fear. I felt my soul being lifted, like a light leaf carried by the breeze. And then, I saw the same scenery as before, the dimension of pure light, the warm embrace of divine love, and Jesus, waiting for me with open arms. He enveloped me in his embrace, and all the weight of earthly life fell away. "Welcome back, my daughter." His voice was the sweetest melody I have ever heard. All around me I saw familiar faces, people who had gone before me, now free from the pain and limitations of the physical world. The Garden of Eden stretched out before me, more beautiful than ever. But what filled me with indescribable joy was seeing the chains broken, the shadows dispelled. Christ's victory was not just over human sin, but a restoration of all creation. I saw the serpent now chained and defeated, unable to do any more harm to those who dwelt in the light. Jesus walked beside me, showing me the heavenly places. "Your mission on earth is over, Calliope. But here, eternity has just begun." As we walked, I realized that the message I left behind on earth had not been in vain. I saw visions of people continuing the work, of souls being freed, of hearts being healed, and then I understood the depth of the words he had given me. "Tell them what you saw." The battle was never against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now, I was on the other side, but my voice still echoed across the earth, leading others to eternal light. If you liked this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.